right, so looks like we're recording episode 3 of Neuropunk Press. Today it's me, Eugene, and Susanna, and a new guest to the fray, Mr. Peter. How goes it?
Goes it really well. I'm glad to be here with you all. Such great people. Susanna, I've heard a lot about you, so it's good to be with you.
It's good to be with you too. Sorry about that.
That might have been my fault. I'm a little wordy, as people say. So.
Oh, that's okay. We value that a lot. So we're looking forward to you being very wordy today.
Word. Sounds great.
So, correct me if I'm wrong, but is a good topic for us to start on, based from where we're all coming from, is the topic of diversity of tactics an acceptable starting point for our conversation today?
I think so, yes. This would be a really good topic to cover today, to get an idea of how we can utilize channels that will give us leverage towards the things we want to do and change for the better.
And I agree, because I had to practice diversity of tactics in my own life.
How so?
Well, I'm a person with a disability, so I do my own personal advocacy, which is sort of grassroots. But I also work for a human, just kind of a disability human rights agency. So in that capacity, I have to do some of the same work, but have to comply with more rules and policies. And I have to be a little more bureaucratic. Now, don't get me wrong, we do good work, but it's difficult sometimes because sometimes the system nature gets in the way of doing the actual work.
Right. Word. So, I we're going to circle back around this, but in terms of diversity of tactics, what would you define for yourself, and even on a broader perspective, is the work that diversity of tactics is practical around?
Well, I think probably the easiest way to explain it for me, and I'm certainly not a subject matter expert, okay? Diversity of tactics is really being able to navigate different types of circles. In other words, if I'm doing grassroots work, I can sometimes move things a little bit faster to help folks.
Right.
Or I can bring in more people and more diverse opinions. And sometimes in my professional life, you can't do that. There are times when the professional role that I have helps, particularly if I'm helping somebody exercise their rights and remedies in an appeal hearing for housing, for example.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, there my title works great, but sometimes getting the person housing, in other words, can be done sometimes quicker on the grassroots level. Like, for example, in my professional life, I have to do a lot of documenting and paperwork for the funding and counting numbers, which takes away the ability of me as a person just going to help the maximum amount of people. And sometimes there's something a person needs that I'm not allowed to do during my work hours.
Right. Yeah. So the first statement that you said, I really feel like summed it up so well, where you basically broke it down as the practice of navigating different circles, right?
Right. They're both are good for different reasons sometimes, but sometimes the My problem is, and this is my personal issue with a lot of times when, like, we have a whole system that supports people with disabilities and other marginalized communities.
Mm-hmm.
But that system, just to provide one service, sometimes takes 20 people because there's different levels of funding that you have to account for. So I would rather see the funds go directly for the service rather than supporting so many people. And it's like there's a system within the system.
Mm-hmm.
We need to get to a point someday where it can be handled on a grassroots level. So we just get it done and we all help each other. And it just flows a lot easier where you get the person what they need and not have to worry about the system, which sort of got them in that situation in the first place. Right. I don't know if that makes sense.
I mean, you're talking about feedback loops between bureaucracy and direct human action, right? Like correct me if I'm wrong here, but you're talking about, I'm not even going to pretend that I can break it down with your level of experience. Would it be asking too much to give some like really practical examples that people might be able to relate to who aren't involved in any kind of mutual aid work, any kind of grassroots work, or even any kind of like bureaucratic nonprofit work or corporate work that has to do with meeting needs? Like, where are some of the experiences that you had that show what you're talking about?
Well, sometimes a person needs something. They need a service, okay? Let's say they need to be able to have access to a telephone and internet, okay? I can do that through work, but that takes a long time. There's processes that I have to justify. Rather than me as an individual would just go down, set them up with a phone and internet or a computer. Now, that, of course, requires that I put out personal money sometimes, which I don't mind doing. But it would be nice to have a fund or have an ability or a team on the local level that if we identify somebody who needs to have access to a computer, phone, and internet so that they can communicate better with the community, that we could just do that. And it could be done quickly rather than writing a whole justification, a plan of action, and why they're going to use why the computer and the internet is beneficial.
That makes sense.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, no, I'm sorry to interrupt.
I was going to ask you what your thoughts were because we haven't heard much from you.
Oh, yeah. Well, I wanted to make sure I was just really listening and absorbing the diversity of tactics. And I agree because, as we're trying to get these computers and everything working, I came across a lot of things in my research where I found, organizations that offer this, but it takes a lot. You have to provide proof of, poverty, basically, to say I'm in need for this, and it takes a really long time to get these things. And I agree here. We need to find a way around that, so that way, we're not having to wait, and people are able to get their immediate needs met, because sometimes time can make or break something. So yeah, that's what we really got to figure out. And that's why on a mutual aid level, I agree here.
I think another issue where that comes up with is housing. And I'm not a fan of rent. So let me just put that out there. Okay, but but I'm going to use this as an analogy. sometimes, if you're working at an agency, you can help a person get housing and help them secure like a deposit and sometimes their first month's rent, but that takes a while to get approved.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas if you need to get someone housing, if you're working with somebody who may need help with, most of the folks that really need housing don't even have basic necessities, bed, any type of furniture. So you're trying to get them the support they need, but there's a process. And again, you have to go through a whole protocol.
Mm-hmm.
And it would be nice if you could just get them what they needed through a team on a local level. And also, I'll confess, I have privilege. I have I'm a person with a disability. I have cerebral palsy, and I have limited use of my mobility, but I got a great team at the house, family, and good friends who support me being able to live, on my own with supports. But I had to, back when I was, not too many years ago, I had to depend on the system for things that I needed. And so I know what it's like to have it where, when you have to depend on the system, and I'm just talking about general human services system, you're often treated as you don't know what you're doing or you're less than because you need help. Now, I will honor the folks. They're trying to do the best they can to help people, but it's the way the system's set up. Again, if you need support, just to have what everyone else who has more privilege there's a problem. We need to come together as a community and realize that everyone is worthy and everyone needs support and everyone can support others.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Go ahead, Suzanne.
Oh, I just absolutely agree with that, 100%. And I guess where I keep on trying to go is to solutions, but
Mm-hmm.
there's no immediate solution. So it's a good thing we're here to discuss it and see what tactics we can use to make that happen, because I recognize that I have a certain level of privilege as well, and I should be using it, for other people. So, yeah.
So we're talking about diversity of tactics, and now we're talking about privilege. And I wanted to reflect some things. This is a really complicated conversation, emotionally, intellectually, socially. I can't really vibe with the need to confess privilege, right? Acknowledging privilege is something I value very much. And I really invite the unpacking of what privilege actually means, because it just gets thrown out real quick and easy a lot of times. But I don't think guilt is a very productive or creative human position. And that doesn't mean that the idea of privilege can't evoke great passion in any number of directions. And I acknowledge that. But I think looking at privilege away from a position of blame and more from a sense of as you mentioned, time is critical, right? As a critical analysis for meeting each other's needs in time efficiently. And if anytime we're talking about changing the paradigm, especially specifically around housing, the conversation is going to hit a wall where the inevitable gate is met of why should those who own property, offer it up without an incentivization of profit, like monetary profit, right? That wall is gonna get hit. And so when we're talking about privilege in that, and we're talking about diversity of tactics, we have to be able to hack all the emotional, linguistic, and social passions that cause us to just like fill all of our bandwidth with reaction, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely. I understand and agree with that, because we have to be emotionally and intellectually prepared for that. Absolutely.
Right. And like, if the more effective this conversation becomes, the more it's going to get closer and closer to the direct communication of that conversation as it exists socially to landlords, you know, individual, corporate, et cetera, that those two conversations are going to hit. And when we're talking about diversity of tactics, it would be, I believe, it would be dangerous for us to just ignore the context that exists in the conversation of diversity of tactics that relates to very, very I'm going to call it what it is, violent emergences in that conversation, right? I personally have a perspective on violence, that violence is a lot more complex than the moral picking and choosing of what violence is correct or incorrect, et cetera, that gets a little bit bogged down in social complexity for me. So I tend to look at like violence as just a very broad, where we hit each other, consciously or unconsciously, you know? So if we're talking about diversity of tactics and we're talking about a threshold of a conversation that has tremendous stakes, we're going to need to talk about violence, right? There is already an energy in our culture where people are ready to rise up and just start taking houses. It's already happening in some places. And that has to be included in the conversation from a diversity of tactics standpoints to prepare for the reactions of that conversation from the other side, from the systems of violence that maintain that a small group of people can own the home experience in a nation over others, right? So, and if this doesn't make sense, please rein me in. If it's going too far, too deep, too anything, too fast, let me know, right? But what are your thoughts on that?
I think I hear what you're saying, and I agree. I want to just clarify one thing. Mm-hmm. I wasn't trying to say that put guilt on privilege. What I was trying to do was explain kind of where I come from, mm-hmm. because I think it's fair for the people who are listening. And I think, well, I agree that you should put guilt on privilege. I think it's important to acknowledge it, mm-hmm. especially because I'm a person who comes from being on, for many years, on housing support. Mm-hmm. You know, years ago when I was young, I was on supplemental security income and I know what it's like I never really went out without food. I always found a place to get food, but I do know what it's like to have to live a different life than I live now. Mm-hmm. And I have to this is just me, mm-hmm. I have to remind myself of what that's like, mm-hmm. so I don't lose sight of that while mm-hmm. I'm working to be an ally and support others. That's right. That's where I was going there.
Yeah, I totally got that. I was speaking specifically in tactical observation of what other people will interpret that as, right? Like other people who hold power may hear this, and because of just the current political climate and language, may agree with some of the most fundamental principles we're talking about, but get pushed off by the language and become emotionally defensive or or aspects of toxic tribalism could emerge that they go, oh, that's one of those people, right? I need to resist those people. And that's the kind of bridge building I'm trying to figure out how to hack, because all the patterns that we're talking about, they affect all of us. They affect those with and without privilege all over the world, you know? So while I'm most certainly not saying that we shouldn't acknowledge privilege, what I'm saying is that as we acknowledge that, it's going to be a real different conversation for a lot of different people, right? And so knowing that it's going to look so different and it's going to cause so many different reactions, and also knowing that right now in America, the capacity for violence to pop off because someone is experiencing a great deal of trauma around anything, like America is pretty key for popping off some violence in any given moment. At least that's my experience of living in it. And so we can have these conversations about peace, but I don't think it would be particularly tactically advantageous to talk about our peaceful intentions without acknowledging where the violence that is in our culture exists around that. It's going to be something we have to talk about anyways. 'Cause at the end of the day, a landlord uses force of eviction as the modulator for generating currency, right? So the violence of enforcing eviction will build up. People will react to that trauma in ways that are going to be violent, and already have been. So I just wanted to bring that into the conversation to just kind of be clear about some of the stakes we're talking about. You know what I mean? Because I think that learning how to de-escalate violence is probably a really good skill these days, right? And if we can all be on the same page around that by hacking the language that a lot of us may or may not be stuck in around that, that could also be advantageous. So I'm just putting that all out there for consideration, given that this conversation is bigger than just the three of us. You feel me? I don't know if that made sense.
Yeah, makes sense. It's all about navigation and leverage. But yeah, absolutely. I agree with that. But I also agree with recognizing, you know, our place, not to a guilt level at all, but recognizing that and taking the time to learn and educate ourselves and listen to those who have those needs. And, you know, it's really like an individual thing. You know, you think about it, what can you do on an individual level? But I get what you're saying. We're trying to sell this to people who, please forgive me if this comes across as incorrect, but we're trying to sell this to people that are perpetuating this violence of not having housing opportunities for people by, you know, creating these obstacles such as rent and, you know, not having the housing built to, you know, make your everyday life good for navigation, you know.
Access, right? It's all about access. Yeah. And I feel like, you know, just to keep the track online, we're talking about diversity of tactics and we're talking about privilege. And this directly ties back in around to what I think is kind of the core of our podcast here, of this specific media platform component of what we're doing, is addressing access, which is anti-ableism, right? Ableism would just be like, here's the thing you have to prove to deserve it. Y'all figure it out. Whoever is at the top of the pile gets it, right? And so anybody that can't keep up for any number of reasons is just going to get mulched, you know? And so creating access to everybody is going to mean meeting everybody in different ways. This is where I think a lot of people get tripped up on the idea of, you know, negating the idea of rent, really, is I think people get stuck in thinking that there's only one way to live that they're familiar with, right? So when we talk, we don't even need to, I don't think we even really need to build more houses. If I'm not mistaken, there's more empty houses now than there are people who need houses, right? So I think the problem materially can be solved just by switching a few ideas. But in terms of more creative conversation, even if there wasn't enough housing, repurposing structures to become housing is also another conversation, because if you negate rent, you're negating a massive market, which means it's going to affect other markets. It means it's going to affect what entities exist in space where. Similar to how a corporation can leave America and go to any other country to change the circumstances that they're working with as a business. So there's a lot of ways we can approach this that are super feasible, but that's not the problem. The problem is the resistance and the pushback. And when that meets, there's just going to be violence, unless the people who have the monopoly on violence just go, you know what, we're just not going to do this anymore. And that's the paradigm shift. People not having access, rising up to take, isn't a new idea. It's happened many, 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 many times. The opposite happening, where the ruling class goes, you know what, we're going to dissolve ourselves into this amazing pool of access and experience. I don't know, maybe I'm not a history buff, but has it ever happened? Has a ruling class ever voluntarily dissolved itself for the benefit of all? I think that's what's at stake. It's got to be voluntary, otherwise it's going to be blood, you know?
That is true. How do we build incentives that will be appealing to the ruling class? That's the biggest conundrum, and that's what we're hoping to seek out at this point in time, to work together, use those diversity of tactics to get the paradigm shift to happen. I agree with Peter. My biggest concern is the immediate needs. Are we going to be able to wait for people to come around?
Right. That's the rub.
Yeah, I think when it comes to diversity of tactics on this issue, and I'm going to give, and I got to confess that I know a lot, but I don't know everything. And I learn a little something every day from people like Gene and other people in my life who I trust. Okay. But I think what we have to do now is work with folks who have housing, who can help folks who need housing have a place to go. Set up situations where, as much as you're able, to have folks, if you have a spare room or something to offer, reaching out to the community and say who can use support. I think that's the first step. I think we do have an opportunity, although I'm not sure how to move it forward with COVID-19. And let me just say that, COVID-19 has been devastating, but there are some additional paradigm shifts. More people are going to be working at home. Remote employment. So you're going to have office buildings and other buildings that may not be as occupied as much. You're already seeing people not really going to San Francisco. So there's a whole bunch of buildings. So can we work to convert those into housing? So I think it's an opportunity. Unfortunately, I don't have all the answers on how to move it forward, and that would probably be a discussion that I think we should have. But excuse me.
Take your time.
Suzanne and Gene, as Gene knows, but Suzanne, my disability makes me cough from time to time.
Oh, no worries. It's okay.
I think diversity of tactics is going to require us to work with people who are decision makers, probably, well, first on the grassroots, but also convince people that they're decision makers in various levels of, and I hate to use the word government, but it's going to be people who can really work grassroots, but also can communicate with those people in power in a way that they can understand. So we really have to be. It'll be key to really stay on message.
Mm-hmm. Agreed. That makes sense too.
Solidarity.
And leveraging tools that we can find,
Mm-hmm.
no matter what.
Yeah, I think that's where the hacking comes in, right? And I when I talk to people about hacking, I get a lot of different reactions. A lot of people think of hacking, I think, as like boundary violation, right? Like I am hacking your bank account, or I'm hacking into your server, or whatever. But I like to think of hacking as just reusing tools in ways that they weren't originally created for, right? There's examples of that all over the place. In electronic music, certain instruments would get developed as people were experimenting with developing synthesis. And then they would release the product with the intention of being like, this is what this synthesis is supposed to do. And then people would get a hold of it and they would just start doing wild shit that the designers never really intended it to do that would change music industries, right? That's hacking. It's just creative reuse in reapproaching of things, right? And so like an example of hacking some of the things that we're talking about, specifically, and I want to be clear, with the intention of building potentially unforeseen bridges that allow us to garner the capacity to make the changes that perhaps like most of us really actually do want to make in order to create a peaceful and thriving world and society. So I saw this video not too long ago, and I'm not like, we live in such politically gnarly times that I purposefully, I want to erase race, gender, class from the video that I saw. And I invite anybody to take bets on all of those things around the people that were in this video. But I'm not going to go into that. But it was a group of people standing around, and they were standing in a circle in this like super posh, loungy, outside tropical area. That like it was so cliche as like the resort vibe. And they were all standing in a circle, and they were all holding a drink in their hand. And the person who was taking the video panned from each one, and they spoke. And then they would go to the next person, and they would speak, and go to the next person. And what they spoke on with pride and gusto, and they'd organized themselves to have a little presentation of how this video was going to unfold to their audience, was how many housing units they owned and how much money they made. So the first person says, 180 units, $2 million this year. It pans over to the next person, 380 units, $20 million this year. And it goes up and it goes up until the last person owns just like some vast system of housing that he's accrued just millions and millions of dollars from. And in order to like hack, I personally had to let go of all perceivable assumptions. So I had to let go of everything around race, gender, and let go of everything around everything, just to be like, what is the actual math of the accruance of currency in time and space, how that relates to materials, specifically housing, period. And what are we working with to build bridges? And I realized that, okay, so what if I like magically had the ability to talk to these people? And I said, okay, what if you took 5% of whatever that, ownership wealth process that you're exclaiming to the world, and you specifically sacrificed it, not to give taxes, not to give charity, not to throw largesse, but in fact, as a very specific new idea that allows for the release of tension and trauma from the accrual of those properties into the generation of something that doesn't negate that and creates a new thing that allows both to exist simultaneously. Specifically, something like co-housing, where housing is created specifically with pre-agreed people. It's not like a public, the house is open, we're looking for applicants to rent a room, you go through the normal process. It's not that. It's a honed process where people who have severe disabilities that need help are housed with people that are able-bodied in some fashion to be able to provide that help in a way that's in a living system where each person is their absolute own autonomous agent that from their sense of home and their actual home then goes and operates in society from their own autonomy. But within the home, it's a system of mutual aid where it's just agreed upon that there's no rent here. And if there is any kind of like revenue stream that comes from the tenants to the owners of the property, it's specifically and transparently for upkeep. It doesn't go into a landlord's bank account to profit on whatever else. It would be specific. This is the money that goes directly into making sure that if something goes wrong, it can be fixed immediately because it has to, because the people that live there have such extreme needs in terms of their capacity for access that any disruption can cause harm, right? Mm-hmm. And so that could create a multidimensional, agency really that involves disabled people running their own lives with the constant, consistent, everyday help from the people that live there, generating its own currency that generates benefit. When I say currency, I don't just mean fiat currency. I don't just mean money. I'm talking about the many facets of human currency. And That currency then creates a stable agent that shows people, look, we can do this thing and create this thing simultaneously. The thing is, at the end of the day, no matter where, even if that happens, there's going to have to be sacrifice from the people who are doing the acquisition of property through, collaboration with the state. Like that process, the people can't move as fast, even if they're super nonviolent, like they can't move as fast as the movement could happen from the release of property from owners, right? And I'm not talking about like, a grandma who's renting out an in-law on her property or something like that. Like the level of impact something like that has in our environment versus one entity that owns hundreds of properties and is just harvesting human labor with just by saying I own this, right? And so I don't know, that was a hack I was thinking of. It's a hack that's technically like no one had to shoot anybody or threaten anybody. It would be a way of getting the capitalists to prove that when they say that this system can provide for people to actually put their money where their mouth is on an individual level without state coercion, right? Because as soon as you get the state involved, you're dealing with a violent agent. That's just what it is. A lot of things. The state is a lot of things, and one of those is a violent agent. That has to be violent in order to maintain itself. So go ahead. I'm sorry. I filled a lot of time and space.
I think you're good, Gene. I like the model. And we kind of looked at trying to do that something back in the 90s and early 2000s. I had a friend who taught me a lot. She lived in Oakland. Her name was Jane Jackson. She was the person who used a power wheelchair, who was a human rights activist and who really did a lot to support everyone. She was very active in supporting the Black Panthers. She was very into a lot of good justice work. And we started working together in the 80s, and she taught me a lot of what I know today around the importance of serving people. And we were trying to come up with this idea that at that time we called wheelchair heaven, which would be because people with disabilities are having a hard time finding housing, and just like now having a hard time getting caregivers. And for people like me, those two go hand in hand because I engage assistance with almost the majority of activities, bathing, dressing, everything I do with the assistance of someone else. And so we were trying to set up a system of having places for folks to live, people with disabilities, and also folks who would also be available to have stable places to live and community, but could also support those who needed caregiving. The problem was that the wonderful state of California came in and said, well, if you want to do that, you need to have a license. Because I don't know why, but, as we said, and I'm going to use the vernacular that we use in the old days. Well, I won't use that vernacular, but if you put so many people with disabilities together, somebody must supervise folks. And we need support. We don't necessarily need to be supervised. Most of us, there are some people who, depending on what stage of life they're in, may need supervision, but the majority of people with disabilities just need the support to live independently. We live, work, and do everything everyone else does, but we need accommodations. And so, again, this is sort of a system thing,
Exactly.
The state. Now, I think as far as diversity of tactics, I think we could do something. I think Jane and I and the other person that was starting to put this together who also passed away, Bob Roberts. He was another human rights activist. I think we were too big in our creativity. We wanted to have like 6 or 8 people, and I think if we kept it below 4 to 6, we'd probably be okay. But again, we were just shocked at the state and said, well, it's a great idea. We were going to pull everyone's resources for attendant care, but you got to have a license. And we didn't want to live in a licensed group home. We wanted to live in community with friends and people we care about. So again, that's one of those kind of rules that they need to get rid of, which is why grassroots is better. I think as far as diversity of tactics, really we learned in most social justice movements, and I'll talk about the disability rights movement, that there were those of us who, I'll use making buses accessible. Back in the day, the bus companies didn't really want to allow wheelchairless on the buses because they all said that we would slow down the buses. And so they would spend lots of money trying to get the general public to be against us. And then I'll make a long story short, but in the advocacy for making buses accessible, you have people on the inside that were trying to work with the governmental entities to get them to change their opinions, meaning the bus transit agencies, and a lot of times they're the bus driver associations or the unions. And then you had people on the street who were walking buses with non-working lifts and, singing, "We Will Ride" at 14th and Broadway in Oakland. I think I have a photo somewhere of me, Jane Jackson, and another lady who passed away, Carrie Gliardi. We were all surrounding an AC Transit bus because it didn't have a lift, and taking time to slow things down and get arrested. You need folks that will, direct it. And diversity of tactics. It has to include people involved in policy, people working on the inside, but also people on the outside who can apply direct action. And then it takes somebody who's able to effectively communicate with all three to make sure everyone's on the same page. And I think that's what it's going to take for, I think how more of the actions that happen. A friend of mine wasn't involved in it, but
Come on.
did my internet freeze?
Mine did, I think. I'm back, though. Are you there, Susanna?
I'm good. It froze for a second, but I got the 3 diversity of tactics policy people from the inside, direct action from the outside, and then a mediator to communicate. So that's where we left off when we got stuck.
Damn good note.
And I think as we move forward in our work, there'll be a little bit of, we'll have to use those tactics again.
Absolutely. They were successful back in the day. They're going to be successful now.
Right. And so in this 21st century conversation, we have to acknowledge that this conversation exists simultaneously with a very real vocal sentiment for like running over people who are slowing things down, like literally running people over with cars that are in the street blocking.
Yeah.
So once again, I hate to be the Debbie Downer of the conversation, but there's a lot of fucking violence in our environment, right? So I feel like there's 2 dynamics around like our current violent environment. One is de-escalation, and the other is commitment, right? So when we find conflict and violence emerging in this conversation, I personally feel like de-escalation is a way that can benefit everybody involved that's involved in a conflict. If the de-escalation isn't specifically practiced just for the sake of not being able to handle the conversation or the conflict at hand, right? Like the idea of de-escalation isn't conflict avoidance. It's because you're in it, right? There is no avoiding. If we're de-escalating, that means something is escalated, right? So the luxury of assuming that things are just going to calm down so we can work it out is not always guaranteed. So we have to be able to work in the midst of escalation. If it's true that we live in an environment that can escalate quickly, it can escalate quickly based on emotional cues, linguistic cues, semiotic cues, body cues, all that shit can get people fighting real quick right now. And I don't know if that's right or wrong. I just know that that's, I think, a thing, right? And so if we're talking about diversity of tactics and that involving pressures and instantiating pressures on others, and if it's true that we exist in a time where that emanation of that vibration of trying to slow things down to be heard is especially likely or specifically likely in our environment to be met with overt physical violence, what do we do with that besides just acknowledge it and feel bad or just, plug on with the same thing we do all the time? Like, how can we bring the escalation to the center of the conversation in a way that's not meant to just further it, that acknowledges it and brings forth synthesis, right? Like the people who, I'm making assumptions here about people. I don't want to do that. But if there are people in our environment that would see, like, say, Peter, say you and a bunch of the OGs from your whole process, like, got together one day and just were like, hey, we're going to reenact this and we're going to get in the way of people. And then all of a sudden, a bunch of you are getting like violence meted upon you. I mean, we've already seen that happen from the state as well. What was it? Was 2 or 3 years ago when a bunch of folks in chairs took over the Capitol? They what was it? I think it was when Trump was getting elected.
Yeah, there was a lot of stuff over healthcare. A bunch of my brothers and sisters were took over, or at least were doing sit-ins at various Senate and Congress clubs. Like, you're right. It's in a world than it was back in the 70s and 80s and when that was happening. And that's something we have to take into account because we live at a time when it's a time of a lot of people feeling emboldened towards violence against those who are pushing for rights. And that's what this is. We're talking about issues that are rights issues. But having said that, there is a lot of folks who would want to do harm for folks that were, possibly slightly out or doing sit-ins or an act of direct action. And I myself, I participated in some, not that many, but a couple of Black Lives Matter protests right as COVID began before. But even I was a person who preferred to march in the daytime. I was nervous about being there at night because now that I'm in my later mid-50 years, I found myself being concerned about my own health and welfare if something happened after dark.
Yeah.
So that's something we're going to have to think about. I do think that there's opportunities because even they're starting to have the discussion about rent. Now, I will tell you it's not going very well right now, but they are at least starting to have the conversation more about rent and and like agency circles and various groups that are dealing with housing issues. They're acknowledging that the rent issue is a problem. It's a struggle because oftentimes you have folks who are landlords that may be near and dear to some people in the conversation. So it's not going well, but the conversation is starting to happen. So I do have hope.
Right.
Because there is enough people who there's more engaging discussion about what we can do. It's not going as far as we need to take it, but at least The door's open now, where it wasn't open at all the first time I brought it up. Now it is. And in fact, one of the groups that I'm affiliated with is going to start a work group about that various discussion. So it'll be interesting to see where it goes. So I think there's some openings, but it's gonna be it's gonna be a lengthy conversation. It's gonna provide a need for diversity of tactics.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Do you have anything to say on that, Susanna?
Well, I think I need to really let it sink in, because I'm going, my mind's all over the place as it is. So I'm trying to harness that and think about what we can do to act as a catalyst. And we talked about, the health and safety of people, after dark and marching. And it just kind of brought me back to the protests this summer and how we had people marching during the day. And then we had groups of people going out at night too. So I'm trying to think, how can we keep a very steady, loud voice through direct action on top of all the other tactics we need to engage in.
I hear that. I feel like that's the grassroots part of it. Does that sound succinct to you, Peter? Like what she's talking about, grassroots?
Right. And I think, trying to make sure that we've got all of our, because we have to be able to we have to get the pressure on, number one. And I think that's what I'm hearing Suzanne Marie ultimately trying to say, and also addressing the issue of how can we make sure people are safe throughout the process too, because, we want to make sure. Now, you can't guarantee safety, but you want to make sure that you have enough people watching over what happens so that there's a way to negate if something does happen.
Yeah.
I know back in the day, we used to use
Hold on a second. Continue, please.
Sorry, I think my dog is making noise.
Oh, no worries.
My dog and the dog next door.
They're having a full conversation. They too are doing a podcast.
Yeah, well, they believe in direct action.
Yes.
Yeah, back in the day, we used to use the National Lawyers Guild. And so we have legal people right there who did that work. And I used to be, that's the National Lawyers Guild, but I used to do some of the legal work too back in the day. But now things are different. And I'll wait for Eugene to get back on the...
Oh.
And okay. I've just realized he wasn't in the frame, so let me wait till he gets back.
No worries.
The dog's a little fascist, man. Like, that's the thing about sheep herder dogs, is they're always telling everybody what to do. Always. They're the fasciest little dogs ever.
We're having a full-on discussion over I was telling Peter, I said, they too are having a podcast.
Right? Yeah. They're keeping it loud. Keeping it loud and authoritarian.
Well, they believe in direct action. And, I do a lot of work around the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA. And my dog thinks that stands for the American Dog Act because she always wants something.
All revolves around her.
Yeah.
Word. So, I mean, shall we call it an episode? We're at an hour right now. I feel like we could go on and on and on. How y'all feeling?
Well, Peter had brought up something before you walked away that I think is important. It's really important for people who are listening who maybe have not been in situations of direct action. So to understand, Peter's history with it would be really helpful because, we learn from those who paved the way before us.
Mm-hmm.
So
a whole lot of people just learned about it at the Capitol this last New Year's as well.
Yep.
That's what's wild about the 21st century is that the slosh of the back and forth between the two perceived wings of the same fucking organism, but the perceived wings, it's sloshing back and forth with the tactics because we can communicate so fast and so far. I mean, I've been watching the dialogue between sides evolve and change so fast. I mean, everything's escalating because we have access like we never have before, right? That's why, I mean, creating a new idea, this is the perfect time. The perfect time for just absolutely new shit that is as creative and adaptable as we as humans are. That, like, this is the time. Like, we can talk to each other at the damn near the speed of light across the planet with a world library in our hand as we walk around. So, like, we have powerful tools, and part of the conversation that's happening right now, this is what brings me hope, is that even through all the just gnarly conflict in the whole of our political existence in America, there's commonalities that do exist that are so primary that I just don't think they can be ignored. When there's capitalists vocally saying we have to change how we extract resources, this is garbage, but capitalism, right? Like, as an anti-capitalist, I'm not going to go, oh, well, because you're a capitalist, I don't agree with you. Like, no, like, yes, what we're doing right now to accrue resources and distribute it, how it's looking right now is garbage, absolute garbage. And it's like opulence and beauty for those that benefit from it. But for those that don't, the trauma that accrues from the cycling process of that, there's nowhere for it to go. That's the downside of our interconnectivity, is that, like, the ripples of expansion have hit the whole world and rippled back so many times now that the only way we have to go, I think, as a species is inward. And then once we go inward, then it's lateral sharing, right? And we need to learn how to see and share with each other in ways that are completely new, like even transcending things that on the left are seen as valuable, like Marxism or anarchism, like just throwing all of that away to get to the root. I mean, that's what radicalism is. It's getting to the root of a thing. And it's like such a dangerous place to be, because to step into the middle of this is to step into the middle of violence. And so if we're trying to solve these things, if we're trying to hack them, that means doing things as they are not perceived to be done as correct, which means that anyone involved in this conversation, we're gonna have to talk about risks. Those risks are gonna be different. For people that are marching in the street now, the risk is literally being murdered by a vehicular manslaughter or vehicular murder. The fear of property owners is losing whatever that empire, that thing is to them, that acquisition signifies, that is core valuable to them, right? Like, that's easy to imagine letting that go if you're not in it. I mean, I try to put myself in the position of someone who's had to distance themselves from the effects of the system that they benefit from enough so that by the time they succeed in the process that garners benefit from that they're willing to undo it to share. I don't see anybody that's doing that right now in a way that challenges things at the root. And the only thing I see challenging things at the root right now is, like, violence, right? is the coping of the state to deal with the violence that's spiraling in our society. And, I'm not at all condoning like class reductionism. There's a lot of complexities to the violence that we're experiencing as a people, but the difference between what having and not having is scales so differently across the levels of class that we have, that even folks that come from a place of changing from one class to another are still going to be shaped by the class they're in, right? So
right.
the entire emotional, spiritual calibration is highly likely to reflect that based on where it is. So any diminishment of that is going to at least make someone defensive, right? It's got to be voluntary. And so, I've heard people talk on the, quote unquote, right wing, and they'll talk about their experience of hearing people speak on certain things that at the core they agree with, but because of how it's presented, they'll just reject it, right? Like if you force me to sacrifice, I'm going to fight that head over heels. But if I have the choice to look at what's going on and make a sacrifice that makes sense, and I can see, oh yeah, if I make the sacrifice, I don't really lose anything, and a lot of people benefit, and we can just kind of reapproach everything, right? Even such massive inertial problems, such as how we currently extract resources, which is pretty intensely destructive, and so in terms of direct action, that's relative to an aspect that you spoke on, Peter, about how the paradigm has shifted because of COVID. And so we're able to do things without having to move around so much. We're getting to see the real impacts of that. We kind of also have a unique opportunity to make sacrifices in who we're even approaching in our lives, right? Like there has been a lot of division on a lot of levels, perceived division. I hear division talked about in our culture a lot, like, oh, it's more divided than ever. It's divisive. This is divided. It's dividing us. And I've struggled with trying to understand what that means because I've never really seen us as a very harmonious organization in the first place, living here in this world in America. And stop it. And damn dog distracted me. I forgot what I was saying.
We were talking about how and I have to agree that we haven't really been harmonious in America.
Yeah, I remember I was going to say building bridges, right? Building bridges. So there's a concept that someone introduced to me recently, and I find it challenging, which is why I like it, which the idea of vibrational tribalism, right? It to me, when this person introduced it to me and I was crunching away on it, I over the last few months in my life and talking to folks, I've been really crunching away at what tribalism is. And I've been researching it in terms of looking at like the research that's defined what that word means, colloquialisms that emerge from it and all that. And, tribalism on a biological evolutionary level is literally just people organizing based on affinity, right? And then what was presented to me by somebody who's a capitalist and a diehard capitalist was the idea of toxic tribalism, where people are gathering by affinity and not allowing each other to shift out of those affinities to explore other affinities. Does that make sense? Like, if you talk to those people, you're not one of us anymore, right? That kind of thing. I mean, and I grew up in that environment. I was raised in an environment where the group I was raised in, I was not allowed to talk to other people outside of that group, except where it was absolutely necessary, like, in public or And even then it was like a decorum was expected around that. So the in-group of the religious group I was raised in, and the whole rest of the world was the out-group. And if you went outside of that, you were punished. So that's what I hear people on the quote unquote right talking about when they're talking about their experience of hearing certain conversations and just not even being willing to hear them because of how they're being demanded it be processed, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You know, like people are going to clench around new ideas. And so I'm not suggesting anybody change anything or not, because I don't have the knowledge or authority to make those declarations. And I think the inertias are so powerful that it doesn't matter if you moralize it. Like trauma is going to make people act out, right? They're going to lash out at traumatic experiences and expressions of trauma. Hey. And, stop. And every time this dog makes my thoughts just shatter. So yeah, building bridges. So what I'm saying is that we, in this podcast, you know, I want to invite people from very, very different perspectives to be brought into the conversation, to be able to see if we can facilitate getting to the root of hacking the conflicts that I think are kind of at the center of a lot of the things we've been talking about, right? And I'm not talking about like Nazis and shit. I'm not talking about having like bigots on the podcast. What I am talking about is having people that are entrenched in the ideological opposite of what I think most of us have been bringing to this podcast so far, which is it gets categorized as the left, but honestly, all these labels, I've read about them a lot. I've talked to them to people a lot. I have a lot of agreements around that. But at the end of the day, I can't help but just see the data of human behavior. You know what I mean? And so I just wanted to open up the platform, if you guys are into it, to find people that want to challenge these ideas in a respectful and actually loving way. Like where we can come to commonality. Like, yes, we want to see people safe. We want to see those systems now. Right. And that doesn't look like state authoritarianism. It looks like what we're building from ourselves. Right. I don't know. What do you guys think about that? Is it too dangerous? Is it too weird?
I think it's okay as long as the person, and all of us have to keep an open mind to really listen. I don't want to get into a situation where I'm arguing. I mean, I don't mind advocating a point or debating, but I just want to keep it constructive. And because I guess I'm one of those people where I have a role in my professional life. I have a role in a couple of boards and commissions. However, I'm speaking as an individual in this podcast. Mm-hmm. So I want to find people who can listen so that none of us really get into like a major destructive argument.
Yeah, we got to keep it constructive.
I do agree. I do agree we need to bring more people than just us, because while I think we have a lot of knowledge, we certainly need to, we need to always look at who's not here in the discussion and who should be here.
Mm-hmm. Word.
I agree with Peter on that, as far as not having arguments and going in circles. Mm-hmm. We really want to see people who are willing to see the data that we're seeing on the human level. And, like Peter said, have it open-minded discussion. But, and again, I agree completely. We need to have a diversity of perspectives. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, we're working to find solutions to the root of problems. Mm-hmm. So one of the things I learned, through school as a graphic designer is that there's no way innovation can happen without diversity. It's impossible. So we do have to do that.
Yeah, I agree. And in fact, specifically, there is something that came up in this last week that's super related to what we've been working on. I just invited, if you look at our Facebook group, our little secret cabal, there's a new person that got invited by the name of Robert. They also have CP, and their introduction into the group isn't just to get their perspective and, you know, their whole addition of the vibe, but it's also to do another pilot project. Because we've been talking about, you know, behind the scenes in this thing, we've been talking about, you know, being project oriented, finding needs, identifying how to gather resources across a diverse level and meeting them. So Robert, and he's already agreed to this, I've already talked to him. We're gonna try to build him a music studio. And he's very interested in getting his hands on some eye tracking software. So, and I've also reached out to this other impact content creator who, check him out on Facebook. His name is Drama B. He's, I can't remember exactly where he's from, but he's doing some amazing work with an example of, like, no matter who you are, where you are right now, with the ability to talk to people across the planet, you can do a lot with that. You can do so much with that. So, you know, when we're talking about not just sitting in the problems and solving them, you know, that's another aspect of this project that, you know, I wanted to just kind of share in real time with you guys that that's happening, while simultaneously pointing out that, you know, that process that we're honing in on with the work that we've been doing, which is just like identify the need, gather the resources, distribute them efficiently, adapt and move on. You know, I think that's something that we can lean into no matter where we are, no matter how each of us is built. Cooperate to identify a need. Check what we got. What are we working with? What are the resources we have? Communicate to organize them and create an outcome. Boom, right? And if the methodologies that we have with working with each other around that are fluid, the process will be fluid, which is, I had a question for you, for specifically you, Peter. So when you're working with someone with cerebral palsy and you're working with language delays, what are some methodologies that you found to help bridge the gap in time that happens in communication when people are communicating together in real time and someone is delayed? What are some practices or some tools that are effective for bridging that gap of time in communication? Because that's practical, not just from an access standpoint, but because in our culture right now, we have a lot of arbitrary pressures to move in time and to communicate in time across certain levels of fairly arbitrary deadlines. So people that are delayed in time with communication are going to be at a disadvantage. So creating systems of access for that time delay, that's actually something I've been trying to think about how we can approach. And I've been wondering, in your experience, what have you found things that have worked around that or not in different places when it comes to providing you know, access to communication for folks with language delays?
Well, there's a couple of things you can do, but it depends on what the person wants.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, like for example, you can, like for example, Zoom enables, you can now do captioning on Zoom, open captioning. I have to figure, it just came out, to be honest. I have
Gotta
to
figure that shit out now.
Apparently there's an icon that will let you, it'll do the captioning automatically. Now, it's not 100%. Sometimes people might use an augmented communication device, like, you know, type out what they're going to say on their communication device, and then when they're ready to speak, they'll hit the button and the phrases will just come out via the communication device. You'll see that a lot at the legislature. Somebody has a prepared speech. But the other thing is sometimes you just accept the delay,
Mm-hmm.
because that too is a form of their communication.
Mm-hmm.
Like, for example, you know, I'm doing pretty well today, but I sort of have to gear up to make sure I talk clearly and have everything in place. So maybe 80% of the time I'm fine. There might come a time when I'm presenting and I have an issue, I cough or something. And I know in my in another life, this person I was presenting with really had a problem with that, and I had to kind of tell her in a nice way to get over it, because you have to. People wanted me to speak faster. Well, if I do that, you won't be able to understand me, and I'll forget something. So it doesn't work for me. So part of it is making the platform in a way that the person can be who they are. We deal with that a lot, you know. But it really comes down to talking to them, and also if there is a concern about the time delay, making sure that they don't feel like it's their problem. It's an issue that we have to deal with collectively. And also, the other thing you want to evaluate is the time delay really a problem, or can the thing be modified so that it's not an issue, where you might, explain to the audience who's watching, okay, when you do your introduction or whatever, I always tell people, although I didn't do it today, I just sort of went right into it, but sometimes I will say, once in a while I cough, once in a while I speak slow, I might take a drink while I'm speaking, and I just would like y'all to let that flow and not worry about it.
Right. I really appreciate the adaptation methodology, because I enjoy being creative, That's why this project of building a music studio for someone with cerebral palsy is really exciting to me, right? Because music involves presence and time. So, but music is also is malleable. Music is what we make it, right? So with the tools that we have at hand right now, like we have the technology to do this, we can create systems of interaction in time as it relates to real time with music, as it relates to an individual's experience of time in making music, in the capacity that we have for making music these days, because you can just freeze music in time and reverse it. And it's just data. So the adaptation methodology, I feel if we lean into that, it's really a conversation of efficient use of all the tools we have at hand. And as you said, listening to the person who the adaptation is being provided for so that they can shape it given all the tools that we have, which we have so many, right? So, I don't know. I think it's an exciting conversation,
Yeah, and I also think that listening is very good for, if I may say, people without disabilities, because it teaches, and this is my own personal bias or perspective, it teaches them to be a little more patient, which we can all benefit from, including myself. But sometimes I'll take a drink just so I can slow down the conversation enough to get people to listen to each other, particularly when they start to argue. One of my favorite techniques, and it is true, if people are talking at once, it's hard for me to track everything. Okay? So I go, all right, everybody, time. With everybody talking over each other, I'm missing part of the benefit of what you're saying. So one person at a time, starting now, okay? And then you reset the whole energy of the room. One of the things that I really get at is work in the room. It's a little harder at Zoom, but I'm getting there. Where you just say, okay, time. Sometimes you can use those time delays as an advantage, especially if it's going, the conversation's really not going where you want it to go. It also works well in hearings too.
I love it. You slow it down. I very much support that slowing down vibe because, you know, on a practical level, we do have these pressures that force us to speed up, go faster, make more, produce more, create more value, be more valuable, and get that done faster and faster. So I very much appreciate that.
And I appreciate the opportunity to be able to listen more, and it does help me understand things a little bit better as well, just because you know, memory doesn't serve me well sometimes. So it's really good to be able to slow it down, so that way if there's something in our conversation that we need to readdress later on, it's helpful for me for my memory to go back to that. So
yeah, for me, listening is difficult the more relaxed it is, to be honest. Like, I find that my brain works better in chaos. Like, for instance, I'm always anxious and tense. Always. Oh, I'm a curmudgeonly motherfucker. But in my experience, when crisis unfolds, when violence unfolds, or the environment is so full of just so much impact that it would seem to be overwhelming, everything gets calm for me. It's the weirdest thing, you know, like, and it happens whether I want it to or not. Like, I've even had times where I've been mugged and I've defended myself non-violently, and I'm watching how to do it. Like, it just goes to completely smooth and unfolds in the overwhelm. And when I'm just having relaxed conversations with people, when people are expressing the simplest things for me, usually there's so much information involved in that it's difficult for me to listen. And so having, you know, friends and comrades that remind me to slow down and listen is really, I love having that in my life. And I just want to echo the sentiment of, like, the power of listening. And I think that's related to bridge building. You know, like, I listen to a lot of really traumatizing shit, just trying to be close to the conflict of our environment so I can understand it. And I think that's kind of a muscle that can be flexed by anybody. Just like being chill, best of your ability, and taking in what's being given and processing it on a deeper level than just the immediate reaction, you know?
yeah. Sorry about that. Didn't mean to interrupt.
You didn't. Go ahead. I was just breathing.
Okay. I just, no, I agree. You know, I do work well in chaos myself. It's just, doing these podcasts, have forced me to really, be relaxed and not be so shy. So hopefully, by next, podcast, I'll get this camera fixed.
Yeah. And, you know, also keep in mind, we're doing these podcasts without any distribution right now. Like, there's literally no one watching this. So, you know, no pressure.
Oh, yeah. No
It'll be
worries.
a different story if we actually start distributing this and there's some kind of momentum that gains, but we're not there yet. We'll get there, though.
Yeah, that's okay.
Cool. So where are we at? Are we calling it? Is there more to talk about? Anybody got any inspirations they feel coming up?
We can call it whenever you're ready, but I do want to say that I really enjoyed this. Just putting it out there. And Suzanne, speaking for myself, I know I can be kind of wordy, and sometimes while I try to find myself a listening, I often talk a lot. So feel free. Plus, Gene and I spend a lot of time talking to each other about these things, so we kind of kind of gel the way that we gel, but I want you to feel free to jump in and certainly enjoy, meeting you today and hearing your perspective. But just as somebody who needs to try to remember to take space, but also make space, you may just have to feel free to jump in, and that's okay. All right.
Yeah, I'll work on that. I think maybe I just need to re-understand my goals, because the fact is, if it were less a verbal conversation and more a text conversation, I'm better at that. So I really need to improve my verbal communication. So these things that we're practicing right now are really going to, I think, help me learn to navigate that better, because I've always been so solitary. So, when I've had experiences where I've been too loud, and I've spoken over too many of people that I shouldn't have. So it's good that I'm learning these things and listening more. So, but I'll jump in. When I find something that might make sense or something that can contribute and help in any way, that's when I will do my best to jump in.
Word. Yeah. Also, you have enduring consent to stop me at any point, because I will get on a ramble. I will get on a really good, solid ramble, and I'll lose the room. So feel free to just step in anytime and be like, I need to speak, because that's dope as fuck, in my opinion, as well.
Well, there's still things I'm learning. So, and I always find value in everyone's, if you want to call them ramblings. I always find value in that. For example, I know you weren't in the conversation yesterday, Peter, but we had a conversation where we were talking about being approached and being, thinking about how we can qualify ourselves to leverage things in a positive way. And so those ramblings, to me, there's something important in there. Really important. So
very generous of you. Thank you.
But I mean, it really is, because it really makes you think, and then you can contribute better by understanding. That's how I do. That's how I function with empathy. So.
Right on. So next, I hope. When we do our next episode, what I've been trying to toss around, I don't watch the podcast. It's all kind of new to me, but I wanted to put forth this experiment. I think I put forth before. I just want to kind of reiterate it. It's like, normally when people do podcasts, there's like a host, or there's like a couple hosts, and they're having guests. I wanted to throw out the idea of actually accruing a collective crew of hosts that organically emerges and, pulls away as people's participation varies based on what's going on in their life. Like, for instance, when we do our next episode, I wanted to invite another guest, but also ask you, Peter, if you wanted to stay in the conversation with us to just keep going, right? Like, you're introduced now as a guest, but the next episode we introduce a new guest, but everybody else is more or less here. So the conversation is constantly growing, you know what I mean? And we can practice listening to each other because there'll be multiple participants, and it's just something different than other people do.
Yeah. And each of us can take turns being a moderator. And I'm thinking that if we get more people as we go on, it might be good to have a list of questions so that you stay on point, because oftentimes, with the three of us, it's easy. With four people, it's easy. With five people and on, it probably gets a little more hectic. So you want to give people the freedom to say what they want to say, because they're experience is valuable, but it might be good to like write up 5 themes. There, let's say, to keep it simple, 3 themes for 2 main themes and a couple of questions to help people stay on track.
Got it.
These are the issues that we want to hear from, especially as our podcast gets, let's say, I would use the housing conversation that we had today. As we get more purposeful with that conversation, we're going to want to convey our messaging has to be good. So you want to kind of not tell people what they want to say, but just give them ideas they'd like them to touch on.
Yeah. Yeah, there's no lack of good ideas floating around right now, too. We just got to create space for them to land.
Yeah, I'm on a panel in a week, I think it is. There's going to be 1,000 people listening. So they were kind enough to give me the 3 questions they wanted me to make sure I answered, and to have freedom to say what I wanted to say. But they said, these are the 3 questions that these are the 3 topics that are yours, So then I can take a few days before and kind of, think about it, write a few things. So when I have to talk in front of 1,000 people on Zoom, I sound like my usual articulate self.
Yeah. Prevents people from like me from stepping in and going off on rants as well.
Well, or being too quiet. So yeah, absolutely. We should start brainstorming some questions together.
Right.
And decide together what we need to eliminate, what we should keep, and go from there.
Yeah. Cool. I wanted to, so there's so many guests we could bring in. I've actually been reaching out to people, and it's difficult because everybody's schedule is different. Everybody in their own lives is dealing with so much, but getting people to galvanize and around schedule to be able to share time with such projects, it's difficult. So, the conversation we got going on in our Facebook posts, our Facebook group, our little secret cabal, we can generate that conversation and getting guests lined up. But I did have someone I wanted to introduce who is a permaculturist who is also in a different position from us with their perspective around capitalism and whatnot. And one of the reasons I wanted to invite them onto the show is because their conversation of permaculture is so fundamentally sound. You know what I mean? That to me, the conversation of capitalism is almost superfluous to its benefit. And so finding someone who's navigating both, I feel like there's a lot to learn there. And potential hacks we can come up with in terms of not just having a place to live with housing, but then actually generating our own food and our own autonomy on a metabolic level, from a violently affixed state, which is what we have right now. But yeah, thanks for the time. Does anybody else want to say anything else, or should we call it?
I just wanted to say, I think that's a good perspective because, part of our goal is to be self-sustaining in some way, and food also plays a role in capitalism. So this would be very good.
Cool.
So.
Well, right on, everybody. Anybody opposed to calling it? You good? All right.
It's been fun.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Peter. Thank you so much, Susanna. Appreciate you both very much.